In 1872, the Massachusetts Board of Education issued a letter of commendation to the Winthrop family, hailing their private educational initiative as a model for moral instruction and rural uplift. 14 schoolhouses had risen in just under 3 years, each painted in muted tones, each topped with a bell. They stood in towns too small for trains to stop in, built on borrowed land with tax-exempt status and no local oversight. The project was funded entirely by the Winthrops' own foundation, fronted by a clean-shaven brother with political ties and managed by their youngest sister, Margaret, a woman described by newspapers as a moral compass in petticoats. Enrollment was handled quietly. Parents were offered food stipends, cloth credits, or in some cases promises of future employment for their children. Attendance grew quickly. Students came in wagons or walked from scattered tenant farms. The schoolhouses became part of the landscape, polite, quiet, faintly smiling. But when the state conducted a retroactive census review in 1973, part of a long-delayed effort to digitize archival town records, something was missing. The children weren't there. Census pages from 1872 through 1880 in the affected counties contained no entries for any of the students who had reportedly attended the Winthrop schools. No listings by name, age, race, or occupation. No notations of births from those communities, nor of deaths. There were teaching staff listed, 2 men, 1 woman, but no headmasters, no matrons, no visiting inspectors. The Winthrop Foundation itself had dissolved in 1881, citing mission fulfilled. The physical buildings were mostly gone by then, some burned in winter fires, some quietly dismantled for lumber. Only one remained standing in the overgrown northern wood of Townsend Hollow. Its bell still hung, though its clapper had been sheared clean through. When investigators arrived to study the site, they found a stack of ledgers sealed in wax cloth behind a false panel beneath the pulpit. The ledgers were not school rosters. There were no grades, no schedules, no inked names of students, no letters to parents, no traces of handwriting by children. Instead, each book contained rows of entries marked only by number and behavior code. The format was mechanical. Subject 11, woke during stillness. Subject 7, spoke without asking. Subject 23, failed mirror compliance. Scores were tallied beside the entries, tallies that reset at the end of each season. The only names ever used were those of donors or visiting clergy. One entry repeated often near the margins. Prefrontal deviation, escalating, recorrect via deprivation. No definitions were given, only once at the bottom corner of a torn page from the winter ledger. Was there a handwritten line in faint pencil? It read, "They forget themselves when they hear their own names too much." The Board of Education's original praise had referenced measurable outcomes in posture, diction, and behavioral silence. What that meant became clearer when an archivist in 1974 unearthed a pamphlet written by Margaret Winthrop herself, titled The Foundations of Harmony. Notes on the Educable Mind, it described a pedagogical theory rooted in the belief that identity, when left unstructured, caused defiance. A child's self must be softened, she wrote, until they resemble what they are meant to become, mirrors, not mouths. The book made only passing reference to the rural schools, but emphasized repetition of posture, mirrored correction, and the elimination of vocalization not prompted by permission. Though couched in academic terms, the language was clinical and cold. She claimed that in the absence of identity, behavior could be shaped not through reward, but through removal. Removal of warmth, of food, of voice, and eventually of memory. Later chapters included chilling anecdotes. She wrote of children who no longer flinched when touched, who could kneel for 12 hours without shifting, who had stopped speaking, even in sleep. She called this the stillness threshold. She claimed it could be reached more quickly with proper deprivation, using methods she described as environmental reconditioning. One method involved silence chambers, windowless spaces where children were held for up to 72 hours without sound, without reflective surfaces, and without names. The final stage was mirror harmonization. No explanation was provided. That term appeared again in the margins of the Townsend ledger, circled in red, with a series of dates that spanned only 2 winters. After the last date, all entries stopped. No legal action was ever taken. The foundation no longer existed. The buildings had decayed. The families who once lived in those areas had moved or died. No graveyards bore the names of missing students. No churches kept records. Only the ledgers remained, neatly stacked, sealed with wax that had hardened like bone, and the faint hollow echo of a bell that hadn't been rung in 100 years. And still, in the corners of the census, the names were missing. Every other entry accounted for, but the children were gone. The ledger had counted them once, but only by number, never by name, and the state at long last admitted it had nothing more to count. Next came the woman who wrote the rules. She was always the quiet one. That's how the early articles described her. Margaret Winthrop, last born of the Winthrop siblings, rarely photographed, often seated slightly behind her more publicly active brothers. While Charles and Everett Winthrop led financial boards and chaired political committees, Margaret worked behind the veil of social reform, publishing essays on the virtues of temperance, the evils of urban distraction, and the necessity of silence in early education. Her speeches were gentle, delivered without fanfare, almost whispered. Women praised her modesty. Men noted her composure. Her critics described her as soothing, a term later historians would find haunting. She was 29 when she first proposed the Winthrop Behavioral Initiative. The pitch was elegantly worded, a network of privately run rural schools, structured around the principle of harmonized growth. The pamphlet contained no mention of curriculum. Instead, it described ideals, posture, cleanliness, discipline, and quietude. In a letter to a regional education council, she wrote, "There is too much noise in the growing mind. Remove the noise and the mind finds its shape." Her proposal was welcomed. The state lacked funding. Her family offered the land. And Margaret promised not to interfere with public schooling so long as her own schools remained exempt from state audits. The exemption was granted without much concern. No one imagined harm could come from a school with no grades, no punishment lists, no failures. Margaret had insisted it wasn't schooling in the traditional sense, it was behavioral preparation. She toured churches. She stood at the fronts of lodges. She read from prepared statements about moral alignment and the dangers of premature self-expression. She quoted scripture sparingly but always returned to one phrase, sometimes attributed to Plato, sometimes reworded as her own. Behavior begins with silence. In time, that phrase became her signature. It appeared at the bottom of posters, on the spines of pamphlets, even engraved into the brass plaques hung above school doorways. And when the Winthrop schools opened, it was the only phrase allowed to be spoken during first assembly. Children were taught to recite it, not as a pledge but as a whisper, 12 times with breath held between each repetition. For decades, her work was considered harmless, benevolent even. But then her diaries surfaced in 1976, 3 volumes found bound together behind the false back of a piano donated to a historical preservation office. The handwriting was neat, slanted forward, even spare, deliberate. But what it revealed was not a woman misunderstood. It was a woman meticulously in control. Each entry was brief, lists, observations, repetitions of phrases like mouths are doors and speech is interruption. She wrote about children as if they were instruments waiting to be tuned. One line, repeated across several months, read, "Stillness is not passive. It is the first shape of obedience." She described how one child flinched each time her name was spoken, and how the behavior stopped when the child was no longer addressed at all. She called it recalibration through removal of reference. Another entry noted that children became easier to control after periods of complete audio deprivation. She had ordered staff to prevent the children from hearing not just voices, but footsteps, birdsong, and even their own breathing. Cotton stuffed in ears, soft surfaces only. No echoes. Most chilling were her thoughts on memory. She believed memory was a habit, one that could be broken. "Do not ask what they recall," she wrote. "Ask what you've allowed them to retain." In one entry, she described a child who cried when asked her own name. Margaret noted, "Shame precedes the loss of self. Excellent result. Extend trial." Nowhere did she describe herself as cruel. In fact, she wrote of her methods with pride, calm, precise, clinical. "We remove names to remove noise," she said. "They do not suffer, they adapt. That is the highest form of survival." Her brothers never commented on the diaries. Her public record remained clean, even in death. Her obituary called her a quiet reformer whose ideas changed childhood forever. But in the margins of her notebooks, among the careful pen strokes and scratch-outs, there remained one constant phrase: looped, looped again like a spell she could not stop repeating. Behavior begins with silence, and in the years that followed, the silence she built would begin to speak. They called it Elm Rose Hollow, though even that name faded before the century turned. Tucked between low ridges near the Ware River, the town was once known for its syrup taps and winter wheat, a place where houses leaned gently together and fields held the same rows for generations. It had no courthouse, no post office, no graveyard large enough for more than 10. But in 1873, the Winthrop Foundation built a school there, School number 5, its bells smaller than most, its woodwork hand-planed by local labor. A note from Margaret Winthrop called the town a model of rural purity unspoiled by external influence. For 2 years it was praised as a quiet success, then it was gone. By 1876, the state no longer listed Elm Rose Hollow on its county maps. Tax records stopped. Railroad logs no longer marked the siding nearby. The town didn't burn. It didn't flood. It simply disappeared from every official ledger. The story told by those few who remembered it said the Ware River had shifted, taken the town in a storm-swollen wave, buried it in mud. That was the myth, passed from one neighboring township to the next. But in 1971, a team conducting aerial surveys for a reservoir expansion flew low over the old river basin. What they found didn't match the flood theory. No erosion patterns, no displaced sediment. The earth was dry, sunken, but not water-scarred. What they found instead were shapes, buried beams in parallel lines, roof frames beneath the scrub, and in clearing after clearing, rings of stones with scorched centers. Fire circles, dozens of them. Each ring measured exactly 9 feet in diameter. Inside, no ash, no wood remnants, just char marks burned into stone. Trees had not grown through them, though a century had passed. The earth inside each ring remained sterile, tested and confirmed by soil analysts as having undergone extreme and concentrated heat exposure. Still, there were no chimney remnants, no hearths. These weren't cooking pits. These were arranged, precise, spaced evenly, some behind where homes once stood, others in symmetrical pairs behind the schoolhouse foundation. The original school itself had vanished, but the fieldstone platform where its front stoop once sat was still there, sunken just beneath the scrub grass. 2 beams lay beside it, blackened and splintered in perfect halves. What disturbed investigators most was the absence of collapse. Towns that die leave traces, tumbled wells, scattered pottery, fence posts still trying to stand. Elmrose Hollow left nothing but the burned circles and 2 stone footpaths that led nowhere. The land hadn't been abandoned, it had been erased. In a regional library, a forgotten box of land deeds dated back to 1870, Elmrose Hollow appeared briefly, listed with 36 properties. 23 of those lots were marked signed in trust to the Winthrop Educational Foundation. No signatures from the previous owners, no payment amounts recorded, just a single note stamped with a hand-drawn sigil never used in Massachusetts land law. An eye with no pupil. From that year forward, not one child from the area was listed in school census rolls. Not one adult claimed tax exemption. And yet, a journal kept by a traveling Methodist preacher who passed through in late autumn of 1874 described a peaceful settlement where the children did not speak, but lined up in perfect stillness to receive bread from the hands of an auburn-haired woman who smiled only with her eyes. He stayed one night in a house near the river. He left by dawn, writing, "I could not sleep with the sound of breathing that was not mine in the room." He returned a year later to find the road gone. Only scrubland, only silence. No survivors ever came forward. No lawsuits were filed. A few surnames associated with Elmrose Hollow appear in surrounding towns later, but without birth dates, without records, drifting names attached to labor contracts or tenement logs. In one such case, a girl listed only as M was admitted to a Springfield orphanage with no speech, no known family, and 3 identical burn scars, small circles, on the soles of her feet. The state issued no report. The maps were quietly updated. The Ware River was rechanneled in 1984, and when they broke ground for a new waterline, one backhoe struck a foundation beam buried deeper than expected. It split clean down the middle. Inside, beneath a layer of silt and dry stone, workers uncovered a slate tablet wrapped in linen. On it, the words etched carefully, "We removed what would not quiet." Elmrose Hollow had not been lost to nature. It had been reclaimed by something colder than flood. And the next town on the ledger still bore the same emblem. The ledgers from school number 3 were found inside the wall of an abandoned Grange Hall scheduled for demolition in 1978. They had been sealed behind a fireplace façade. 9 bound books wrapped in oilcloth, each labeled not with years but with phrases like first harmonies, second quiet, the breath seasons. The handwriting was uniform. Ink never blotted. There were no student names, no dates, just rows of entries, tidy, methodical, numbered always with primes. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17. Each entry followed a rigid format, the number, the time of infraction, the behavioral code, and the method of redress. The most common code was FBW, repeated hundreds of times. A key scratched faintly on the back page defined it: failure in breath work. Another abbreviation appeared less often: DKM. Its meaning wasn't explained in writing, but a paper scrap tucked into the final ledger offered a phrase that made the term clearer: did Neil move? The punishment methods varied, but each entry ended the same: retest before meal. No physical descriptions of the students were recorded, no emotions, just compliance failures. In one chilling entry, the number 29 was noted for audible exhale 14 seconds past stillness bell. Redirected with palm weight and mirror seat. That same entry ended with a note: palate tremor ceased, harmony possible. Former residents of the nearby hamlet, interviewed decades later, recalled hearing cries from beneath the old school chapel floor. One described a single drawn-out sound, like a child trying not to weep fully, failing every few seconds. Another, a retired postmaster who delivered letters to the school once a month, said he was never allowed inside. They opened the door just wide enough for my hand, he said. Never saw more than the same two fingers reaching out. A housemaid from a farm 2 ridges over told of once seeing children lined up in the snow, barefoot, unmoving. Their lips parted but no breath visible in the cold. But the most disturbing account came from a woman named Eleanor Carlin, who claimed she had been taken to school number 3 at age 9 after her mother struck a pastor's boy for speaking over her. Her interview, recorded in 1981, was fragmented. Her speech broken, her gaze often cast toward reflective surfaces she insisted be covered. But she described one memory in perfect detail. The room, she said, was tiled in fragments of mirror, floor to ceiling. Each child was made to kneel on the cold surface, their own image below them multiplied endlessly around. They were to remain still from the first bell until the second, which did not come at regular intervals. Sometimes it rang within an hour, sometimes not until darkness fell. She said they were told stillness was proof of obedience, that breath was noise, that the body's twitching, its tiny shifts and sways, were the enemy of harmony. Those who failed, who moved too much, who trembled, who wept, were taken through the far door and did not return for days. Or ever. In the ledger, numbers would vanish from sequences. 11 might be followed by 13, but never 12. There were no even digits, no symmetrical marks. The prime numbers were intentional, Margaret Winthrop had once written in a personal margin, because primes are indivisible. Just as the pure mind must be, children were not to be grouped, not to build alliances, not to speak even to one another. The only sound allowed during stillness was the bell. And the bell did not always ring. In one recovered punishment schedule, a final entry reads, Subject 43, achieved full mirror harmonization, expired during DKM retest, no sound reported, no name, no funeral. Just a number and a phrase that no longer shocked the archivists by then. What had begun as a school had not functioned as one. It had been a machine, designed not to teach but to strip, to reduce motion, reduce identity, reduce breath itself, to reach what Margaret called zero-pulse compliance. The test of stillness was never passed. It was endured until it broke the child, or erased them. The chapel floor, when unearthed in 1980, revealed no bodies. But beneath its boards, mirrored tiles still shone, untouched by dust, cold to the hand. And in the silence between breaths, you could almost hear something waiting to move. The logbook came from a county infirmary long since torn down, its fieldstone bricks repurposed for garden walls and chicken sheds. It was catalogued by accident, tucked inside a mislabeled folio marked Rheumatic Care, and opened only when a graduate student in gerontology requested source material for a thesis on 19th century bone disease. The book was bound in rough leather, its pages stiff from time and humidity. But the ink had held. It bore the neat, decisive script of Dr. Lemuel Brandt, who ran the middling parish orphan infirmary from 1871 to 1878. His handwriting never wavered, but as the pages turned, his tone did. The early entries were routine. Scrapes, swollen joints, mild dysentery. Then came the fall of 1874. Between September and December of that year, 32 children were admitted to the infirmary, all transferred in groups of 3 or 4 from various Winthrop facilities. Their stated ages ranged from 7 to 11, but their physical appearance contradicted every known metric of development. Dr. Brandt noted early signs of alopecia in several cases. In others, complete graying of the scalp hair. Bone scans, rudimentary at the time but carefully noted, revealed spinal curvature more consistent with advanced age, and in one case, a collapse of vertebral spacing typically seen only in the elderly. They walked as if the joints refused smooth movement, with shortened stride, hesitant balance. One child's femur showed scarring and density loss so severe it bent under weight. She was listed as 8 years old. None of the children spoke. Not when prompted, not when held, not when screamed at, as one nurse recorded in a moment of shame and frustration. Their mouths moved only to chew, and even that took coaxing. They refused games, ignored dolls, stared without focus. Most disturbing to the staff was their sleep. Each child would lie down precisely at dusk and wake before the first light, eyes already open, as if they had not been sleeping at all. During the night they made no sounds, not even when turned, not even when prodded. They blinked less than normal, and one nurse swore that several of them never blinked at all. Dr. Brandt attempted to backtrace their origins. Birth records for all 32 children were requested from state files and county churches. Not one returned a match. No names, no baptismals, no census notations. Their intake forms from the Winthrop facilities were uniform. Single pages bearing only the child's assigned number, a brief note on cooperative status, and a recommendation for isolation and continued evaluation. One form bore a smudge of dried blood in the upper right corner. Another carried the faint imprint of something pressed hard and quickly, later identified as a palm with abnormal spacing between the fingers, as though the hand that made it had not fully formed. The children were housed in a wing of the infirmary closed off from regular patients. Reverend Calden, a former chaplain brought in to assist with moral guidance, kept a separate journal during this time. In it, he wrote less of scripture and more of watching. They no longer pray, he noted. They wait, as if for something that has not yet been given permission to return. He wrote of nights where, walking past their quarters, he felt an overwhelming pressure in the air, as if the building held its breath. Once he opened the door to their ward and found every child sitting upright in bed, eyes on the floor, hands folded. No one had instructed them. No one had stirred them. They did not look up. He said he left the door open behind him, walked backwards into the corridor, and did not return until morning. Within 6 months, 27 of the children had died. Causes listed were inconclusive: respiratory failure, organ atrophy, unresponsive collapse. 5 remained. They were transferred quietly to a private convalescent home operated under the continued funding of the Winthrop estate. No further records exist of them. What lingered was the pattern. Children sent from facilities designed not to teach, but to alter. Children who bore no histories and decayed as if something had used them up too fast, as if the silence itself had aged them. And in the final line of Reverend Calden's journal, one sentence remains. They were not orphaned. They were returned. The original architectural schematics for the Winthrop schools were remarkably consistent. 14 structures, identical in shape and footprint, a single level, modest bell tower, modest clerestory, and no cellars. Their uniformity had long been a point of praise in Board of Education documents from the era. Clean, functional spaces for rural moral formation, one inspector wrote. But those blueprints traced by county clerks in 1872 bore no signs of revision, no alternate drafts, and critically, no staircases leading down. And yet by the 1940s, as part of the Works Progress Administration's Oral History Initiative, a pattern began to surface in transcripts collected from laborers who had once worked on or near the Winthrop sites. Several described back rooms that echoed wrong. One referred to a door that should have opened onto ground, but instead revealed 3 steps, then 9, then far more than a man should walk without hitting dirt. One custodian, named only as Mr. R., spoke in hushed tones of a stairwell that descended forever. He claimed to have followed it one night in 1923, drunk from a wake and curious about the trapdoor behind the eastern hearth of school number 6. The steps, he said, were dry and narrow and seemed to flex subtly under weight, as if not fully anchored. He walked for what he believed was 10 minutes before he saw a flicker, not of flame, but a dull amber glow. He stopped, too afraid to call out. The light came from a room, not large but curved like a thimble, with walls paneled in smooth copper. The copper had darkened in places, stained black in long vertical streaks like oxidized blood. Lining the walls, he swore this, were shoes. Dozens, perhaps more. All identical in size, shape, and color, small, left-footed with stitched soles. Each was placed with care, heel against wall, toe angled inward. He touched none. He turned and left, or tried. The climb back up took longer than the descent. He emerged covered in grit, his hands trembling. He told no one until years later when the interviewer asked about strange things in the school buildings. The janitor paused and said softly, "They lined the room like teeth, and none of them pointed out." The WPA archivist filed the story, marked it as hearsay, and moved on. But 5 years later, in 1947, the same janitor was found dead inside his tool shed behind an abandoned trolley yard. Cause of death was ruled as accidental exposure. He'd asphyxiated after lighting a kerosene stove beside a leaking tank. But what investigators noted, and what newspapers never printed, was what had been done to the ceiling above him. 32 shoes had been nailed to the rafters in a precise ring, each one different sizes, different ages, some clearly decades old. One pair bore signs of warping from extreme heat. Another still had traces of red thread where a child's name may have once been stitched, but the cloth had been picked away, carefully, surgically. None of the shoes matched, not to each other, not to any known local family, not even the shoes worn by the janitor himself. The nail pattern was clean even. It had taken time. Whoever had done it had known exactly how they wanted it to look. And no fingerprints were ever found on the hammer left near the door. After that, rumors of the Winthrop basements spread quietly through the preservation offices. Archivists noted discrepancies, minor but consistent. Blueprints from different counties all missing the same corner markings. Surveyors' field reports that referenced sinkage with no structural cause. 2 different demolition crews reported jackhammers suddenly failing when breaking beneath the central hallway. One workman said the concrete beneath the school was too soft to crack, too hard to break, as though it had never cured or had become something else. No official excavation was authorized. No public statements were made. The basements had never existed on paper. And without paper, the state would not act. But those who had worked there, who had swept the floors, changed the oil lamps, patched the roof lines, they remembered the stairs. And they all agreed on one thing. They never heard anyone coming back up. In the spring of 1876, 6 families arrived unannounced at the gate of Winthrop School number 7. Each demanding the return of a child enrolled the previous autumn. The parents had sent their sons and daughters for the boarding term, lured by the promise of discipline, quiet dormitories, and a curriculum free of the urban vices plaguing public schools. But months had passed without a single letter. Previous inquiries had been met with short typed replies, unsigned and identical. Your child is progressing toward compliance. Direct visitation will compromise their immersion. The families waited outside the front entrance for hours until a narrow-faced woman in a wool shawl emerged. She wore no badge, no signifier of rank, but spoke with confidence. The children, she said, could not be released. The immersion trial was ongoing. Disruption at this stage would be a breach of alignment. She offered no apology, no explanation, When one mother demanded to see her daughter, the woman repeated herself in a near whisper, "They are still immersed." That phrase appeared again in a letter received weeks later by one of the parents. The paper was damp at the edges and smelled faintly of vinegar. The letter read simply, "To withdraw now is to undo everything they've learned. Stillness must be sealed." The families filed formal complaints. The county sheriff attempted a wellness check but was turned away at the property line, informed by a lawyer for the Winthrop Foundation that the children were under private contract. Without names on public school registries and with the legal loopholes afforded by religious exemption, there was nothing to pursue. No warrant was issued, no charges filed. The children never came home. Their names were forgotten outside of those 6 households. Over time, even those families scattered or disappeared, 2 to illness, 1 to westward migration, 1 to institutional care. School number 7 was shuttered 3 years later for what the foundation called environmental strain. The building remained intact, though slowly overtaken by creeping moss and root-cracked stone. By 1916, the property had been sold to a local developer who intended to demolish the site for pasture land. The well behind the school was the first structure set for removal. It had been dry for decades, capped with rusted tin and partially filled with debris. When the workers lifted the cover and began excavation, they expected loose soil, perhaps remnants of stone lining. Instead, they struck wood. 17 chairs sat submerged upright in a shallow pool at the well's base, placed with unnatural precision in a perfect circle. The wood was aged but intact, each chair resting flat and untipped. When the muck was cleared, the workers saw that every seat had been carved, not painted, not etched, but carefully cut with a single word. The words were the same on each, not a name, not a date, just repeat. No bones were found, no clothing. But something in the water had stained the chair legs dark, almost red. The coroner on site declared it groundwater iron. Others disagreed. A sample was taken to a local chemist who refused to confirm the contents in writing but told the foreman privately, "That wasn't rust." The chairs were hauled and then lost, misfiled, claimed by museums, or perhaps quietly destroyed. Only a grainy photograph remains taken by a local teenager who had snuck onto the site. The image shows the chairs under morning light, one slightly askew as if it had been shifted too late, or had once held something that moved. Years later, during a fire inspection of the remains of school number 7, a hidden crawlspace was discovered beneath the dormitory wing. Inside, a small chalkboard sat cracked in the dust, its only legible phrase written over and over in faint white, "I am still here, I am still here, I am still..." and then nothing. The rest of the school was demolished, grass was seeded, the foundation erased. But the well was never fully sealed. Each attempt to fill it collapsed in on itself. Concrete cracked, soil caved. And even now, in certain seasons when the air goes still, locals say the sound from that patch of field is not wind. It is something like chairs dragging in a circle, and a child's breath that never ends. The box was discovered during a routine inventory audit at the Coldwater Historical Museum in 1989, sealed tight beneath a staircase labeled for flood storage. It had been listed decades earlier as Educational Ephemera, Winthrop Collection, yet bore no catalog number and no accession record. Roughly the size of a sewing chest, it was made of cedar reinforced with brass bands and locked with a rusted clasp that snapped cleanly when touched. Inside, nestled among layers of brittle linen and ash-colored paper, were 9 preserved human tongues. They were not dried or shriveled. They had been cured intentionally, soaked, treated, and sealed in waxed cloth, each wrapped individually, each marked with a small black stitch at the base. What stunned the curators was the detail. On the underside of every tongue, stitched faintly but precisely, were single words: harmony, one, echo, silence, comply. Each was sewn with thread so fine it seemed to vanish into the meat of the tissue, yet the letters held shape even after a century. When one was examined under magnification, curators noticed not only the stitching but signs of deliberate etching. Small linear scarification beneath the fabric, like grooves set in advance to guide the needle. The museum called in forensic specialists. The tongues were confirmed human, each from a child between the ages of 7 and 10. The tissue bore no signs of post-mortem decay, but more disturbingly, there was no evidence of free bleeding. The tongues had been removed surgically, then cauterized, but not post-mortem. Cellular structures suggested blood had still been circulating. The children, it was determined, had been alive, though likely sedated when their tongues were cut, and awake enough to experience pain. The artifact box contained no identifying labels, no dates, only a folded slip of paper buried at the bottom. It read, 9 completed. Others failed trial. Harmony must not fracture. It was unsigned. But the handwriting matched a sample of Margaret Winthrop's recovered notes from the Townsend Hollow ledgers. Her phrasing was clinical, always, detached. But there were hints, patterns, echoes of what this act had meant in her framework. "Speech is where identity hides," she once wrote. "Remove the root of dissent and you eliminate the impulse." This was not punishment. It was ritual, a method, a shaping. When the artifact box was traced to its origin, it led back to school number 2, located just outside Ashby. The building had been demolished in 1906, but local archives held a final inspection report from the week before closure. A footnote from the assessor mentioned that the primary discipline chamber had no desks or chalkboards, only benches and wall hooks. No clarification was given. A janitorial log from the same year noted the disappearance of an entire first form class, but was struck through in red ink, labeled as internal misfile. In an anonymous letter sent to the Coldwater Gazette weeks after the museum story leaked, a man claimed his grandmother had once worked as a kitchen hand at school number 2. He said she never spoke of what she saw, only that sometimes they'd bring children in silent and they'd leave quieter. She said no child ever returned to the kitchen twice. She died in 1962, but one sentence from her diary survives. It reads, "They didn't cry. That's what broke me. They didn't cry." The museum never reopened the box. After the analysis, it was sealed again, this time under stricter protocols and placed in controlled storage. Staff refused to display it. Some refused to work near it. One intern resigned after claiming she heard whispering whenever she passed the archival wing, repeating the same word, echo. Later review of the box's construction revealed that its lid had been lined with sheet lead, likely to slow decay. But the inside edge bore 9 notches, thin, deliberate cuts spaced evenly, matching the number of tongues. Matching, perhaps, the seats once filled by children who were told their silence was not enough. That to belong, they must give up not just their voice, but the part of themselves that knew how to form one. She arrived without escort. No one saw her come through the gate. The nurse on duty at Danvers State Hospital in March of 1911 said the girl was just there, standing barefoot in the fog beside the eastern entry, wearing a soiled wool shift with no buttons, no tags, no lining. She looked around 11, though later assessments placed her closer to 16. Her scalp was clean-shaven but unevenly so, as if done in panic. Her hands were clenched tight, fingernails bitten to the quick, the skin on her wrists ridged with scar tissue. She gave no name. She made no sound. The staff named her Clara J., the J for Jane, as was custom with unclaimed girls. Initial examination revealed severe nutritional depletion, chronic dehydration, and what the attending physician called ritualized surface etching. thin, shallow scars carved into the underside of her arms in repeated diagonal patterns. When asked how she'd come to Danvers, she blinked once, looked to the corner of the room and whispered something unintelligible. Over the weeks that followed, she was placed in a low-stimulation ward. But at night, nurses noticed something strange. Clara would sit up in bed and begin pressing the end of a pin, stolen from her mattress lining, into her forearms. Not stabbing, writing. Letters, small and evenly spaced, traced into her skin with obsessive care. It took weeks before anyone could decipher the pattern. They were lines, repeated lessons. Silence is the body's true voice. To remain is to earn. Stillness must be perfect or it must be corrected. Phrases identical to those found in the ledgers from Winthrop schools, specifically from the immersion phase outlined in Margaret Winthrop's unpublished manuscript, The Foundations of Harmony. The wording was exact, including grammatical idiosyncrasies like unnecessary capitalization of stillness and obedience. Her arms became a scroll, each night new lines. When gauze was applied, she'd wait for it to loosen, then begin again beneath it. Staff tried restraints, but she remained eerily calm, offering no resistance, no outbursts. She simply stared at her own hands, flexing and curling them slowly as if testing for damage. She ate without complaint, bathed without prompting, but she never asked for anything. Never reacted to noise, never responded to her name. In 1914, during an auditory test for sensory disorders, a psychiatrist played a series of tones to measure Clara's reactions. She was unmoved by pitch or volume until he played a 7-second clip of distorted bell resonance, an archival recording made near one of the original Winthrop properties. At that moment, her pupils constricted, her hands seized, and her jaw locked. She remained frozen for several minutes, then turned to the wall and began whispering, "It didn't ring for me. It didn't ring for me. I passed. Those were the first full words she had spoken since arrival. Years passed. Staff rotated, files shifted from one cabinet to another. Clara remained, neither violent nor improved. But one nurse, who stayed from 1918 to 1926, kept a secret journal. In it, she wrote of Clara's uncanny stillness. "She never blinks unless you blink first," the nurse noted. "She mirrors your posture down to the fingers, but only after watching. Never first. Never naturally." The nurse believed Clara was mimicking, perfectly, not learning, repeating, as if her mind had once been rewired to perform, rather than to be. In 1931, 20 years after her admission, Clara J. was asked by a visiting psychiatric researcher why she thought she had been institutionalized. She turned her eyes slowly, looked at nothing, and replied in a hoarse voice, "I passed the stillness test. Why did they keep me?" Then she smiled, an expression not recorded before or since. Clara J. died in 1934. No cause could be determined. Her heart stopped mid-rest, her hands folded neatly over her stomach. The scars on her arms had begun to fade, but under ultraviolet light, faint patterns still showed. The last line she ever wrote was not from any known Winthrop lesson. It read, "The ones who moved were let go. The ones who stayed became echoes." She had not blamed them, not once, not in tone, not in word. She had only asked why they didn't let her go. They were uncovered in a state archive basement in 1983, filed incorrectly in a cabinet marked Agricultural Showcases Rural Fairs, 1870-1880. There were no fairgrounds in the images, no crops, no livestock, no prize ribbons, just wide, empty fields, just children. 13 sepia-toned photographs, each mounted on brittle backing paper, each stamped with the same neat ink. Winthrop School Exhibitions, 1875, The location varied, school number 1 through number 13, but the composition did not. In every image, between 20 and 40 children stood in precise rows, hands raised chest high, palms pressed flat against their own sternums. Their feet were spaced exactly shoulder-width apart. Their mouths were closed, their eyes slightly glazed as if turned inward or detached from what they saw. And in every single photograph, one child was blurred, always just one, always in a different row, sometimes near the edge, sometimes in the center, but always present and always indistinct. Face smudged, limbs faded as if caught mid-movement. But these were long exposure images taken on equipment that demanded stillness for clarity. In those days, a blink could cause a faint ghosting across an entire plate. But in these photos, the rest of the class stood in crystal focus. Only the one, always one, seemed in motion, though the pose remained the same. Experts were brought in to examine the plates. No signs of damage, no developer error. The distortions were internal, not scratches, not mishandling. A photographic historian noted that the blur did not follow the expected patterns of motion. It wasn't a sweep or smear, it was a disassembly. The blurred child's features seemed to unravel outward, pixel by pixel, before pixels even existed, as if the child had begun to dissolve before the shutter closed. Attempts to identify the photographer failed. The backside of one mount included a penciled initial, MW, but whether this referred to Margaret Winthrop or someone else was never determined. No other documentation of the Winthrop school exhibitions existed. There were no parent invitations, no public notices, no newspaper announcements. The only clue came from a brief line in one of Margaret's unpublished papers found decades earlier. When the lesson takes hold, their form reflects it. The blur is a failure to absorb. Archivists studying the children's body language noted something else. None of the students in the photographs appeared to be holding their own shape. Their posture was too exact, too mirrored. Some bore left-handed asymmetry, yet posed with their right hands forward. Several showed signs of physical strain, a shoulder too tense, a foot buckled slightly inward, but their expressions never shifted. Only the blurred child in each frame appeared to resist. One particularly haunting image, labeled School No. 11 Autumn Assembly, shows a boy near the back with his arm still lowered. He is the blurred one. Unlike the others, his head is tilted slightly, as if listening to something behind him. His face is gone, not in shadow, but in a fog-like smear that expands past the borders of his own outline. Brushing against the girl beside him. Her shoulder shows faint distortion as well. Her eyes, barely visible, seem widened, not in pain, but in recognition. A researcher assigned to digitize the images noted that when scanning the files, the distorted faces created interference. Her monitor would flicker. On 2 occasions, her headphones emitted high-pitched tones without audio input. She stopped after image 9. The photographs were eventually boxed again and stored under stricter categorization, listed now under unexplained educational artifacts. No public display was ever approved. The photos had an effect on people. Curators began reporting headaches, short-term memory lapses. One staff member, after cataloging them, left a note at her desk that simply read, "They are still learning." And though every child's expression was blank, one investigator claimed that if you looked long enough at the blurred figure in each photograph, just long enough, you'd feel the slightest tug. Not physical, not visual, just a pull, like something realizing it had been seen, and trying just once more to finish the lesson. The demolition of School No. 4 was supposed to be uneventful. Scheduled in the summer of 1966 to make way for a highway bypass, the structure had stood abandoned since 1902, its roof sagging, its windows papered over by wind and time. The Winthrop Foundation had long since dissolved, and no family laid claim to the site. The building had no legal protectors. Only a local preservationist, Dr. Howard Elkins, requested access before the structure came down, hoping to document what he called one of the last unexamined echoes of rural reform. He was granted 2 weeks. What he found was not part of the floor plan. On the 3rd day of his survey, though, Elkins and his assistant noticed something odd about the north corridor. The measurements didn't match. From the outside, the structure extended 48 feet, but the interior corridor ended at 39. They assumed rot or collapse had sealed the rest. But when they tore away the wall paneling, they uncovered something else, a doorless seam in the plaster, flush with the wall, framed by faint grooves in the wood. There was no handle, no latch. But when they pressed their palms against it together, the seam cracked. A release. Behind it was a chamber, hexagonal, windowless, and cold despite the summer heat. Every wall was mirrored. Floor to ceiling. The air was dry, unnaturally so, and carried no smell. The mirrors were not decorative, they were functional, seamless, fused into the walls as if poured into the structure rather than hung. At the center of the chamber stood a raised stone platform about knee height, with a circular top polished to a glassy sheen. Its surface was scratched, not randomly but methodically, as though someone had carved patterns into it over time, then smoothed them down with repeated pressure. When Elkins stepped inside, he stopped moving after 4 paces. His assistant, standing at the threshold, later said he just froze. Shoulders slack, mouth slightly open, gaze unfixed. Elkins later recalled hearing a sound, a low, constant hum like breath held just before speaking. No one else heard it. He said it came from the walls, that it wasn't the hum of electricity, but something closer. Underneath the hum, he heard breathing, childlike, shallow, rhythmic. He turned toward the mirrored wall to see if it was an echo, but the reflections didn't follow him precisely. In one, his hand twitched before he moved it. In another, his lips parted while his own mouth remained shut. The mirrored ceiling bore the final message. Etched faintly, barely visible until the flashlight beam hit at the right angle. 4 words. Begin again. Begin again. Written in reverse. Elkins had to hold a small pocket mirror to read it properly. The phrase repeated in a loop, with the last letter of one word touching the first of the next, forming an unbroken chain. When he tried to step closer to read it more clearly, he stumbled, though he couldn't say why. The floor had not shifted, but he said it felt like something gripped his ankle. The assistant refused to enter the chamber. She watched from the threshold, her hands shaking, claiming she felt pressure against her chest the longer she stared at the mirrored walls. As Elkins exited, he whispered something she didn't understand at first. She wrote it down anyway. There's no center. Later analysis of the chamber structure showed no insulation, no joints, no concrete, just plaster, mirror, and a hollow behind the walls filled with fine, dry sand. No one could explain how the chamber had been sealed, how it remained structurally intact, or how the interior temperature remained 30 degrees below the rest of the building. Acoustic testing inside produced odd results. Sounds made inside the chamber did not echo. Instead, they returned slower, delayed by milliseconds. The delay increased the longer one remained inside. After 20 minutes, one researcher found his own footsteps reaching his ears seconds after he stopped moving. The mirrors, when analyzed under spectrum light, revealed faint oil marks, small circular prints, child-sized, positioned not at face level but kneeling height. The platform bore signs of repeated pressure consistent with kneeling as well. As if for decades children had entered the chamber, knelt silently, and waited for their reflections to still themselves. No names were associated with the room. No school blueprints ever listed it. But Elkins found a single ledger entry from 1875 labeled Final Phase, Internalization Room F. The outcome was marked incomplete. One word was scrawled next to the entry in what appeared to be a different hand: returned. The chamber was dismantled the following year. The mirrors were cracked, but none shattered fully. The platform was moved to storage, where it remains untouched. And Elkins? He published nothing. He retired within the month. But in the final notebook entry before he left the university, one phrase was circled 3 times. Reflections do not copy us. They study. And one day, they act first. The box was marked with a simple number, 36, and stored in a restricted records vault beneath the State Board of Education's headquarters in Boston. For nearly a century, no one touched it. The file logs had been redacted. The access request sheets were empty. The entry key was handwritten and faded, tucked behind newer folders like something someone wanted forgotten without risking destruction. It might have remained sealed indefinitely if not for a whistleblower, an internal records clerk named Lyle Vane, who in 1992 leaked its contents to a small investigative journal focused on abandoned institutional histories. He was fired within a week. But what he uncovered forced a truth into the open that had only ever been whispered about. The Winthrop schools had not been fringe charity experiments. They had been sanctioned trials. Inside the box were 5 manila folders, brittle with age, labeled BAP, Phase 1 through 5. The acronym stood for Behavioral Advancement Program, a cooperative initiative between the Winthrop Foundation and a federal bureau whose name had changed too many times to trace directly. The reports confirmed what no one had dared to believe, that the government had quietly funded the Winthrop program from 1871 through 1881, viewing it as a controlled environment to test compliance thresholds in juvenile populations removed from parental influence. The wording was cold, bureaucratic. Phrases like identity minimization, obedience induction, and volitional dampening appeared in every phase. The goal was not education, it was calibration. How long could a child go without hearing their name before self-reference collapsed? How many hours of stillness before external command replaced internal will? Could speech be erased entirely, not just by trauma but through structural conditioning? The reports referenced environmental deprivation chambers, sensory rotation halls, and what they called mirror harmonization trials. School number 4 was mentioned by name. So was the chamber later unearthed beneath it. But most damning was the final ledger labeled Subjects, Closed Status. It listed 243 children, only numbers were used, never names. Each line contained approximate age, intake condition, trial type, outcome. Of the 243, only 17 were marked relocated, verified burial. The rest were labeled with various closings: return to foundation, result unstable, or worst of all, silence achieved, no further reporting. No parental records were attached, no birth certificates. Only a single note scrawled along the edge of the final page. Final subjects exceeded auditory latency expectations. Visual recall erasure incomplete. Recommend closure. The ink had run slightly, as if smudged by a hand that hesitated. When the journal attempted to publish the findings, it was quietly sued out of existence. But a copy of the files had already made it to an independent education oversight committee. From there, parts were leaked to local historians who began matching the intake dates with missing persons reports from the 1870s. The numbers aligned too well to ignore. Still, no formal investigation was launched. The agencies involved had changed names too many times, folded into larger branches, or absorbed by budget cuts. The foundation was long dissolved, the buildings mostly gone, but the ledger had been reopened. The silence it had sealed was broken, and silence once broken does not return the same. The mirror was installed in the spring of 1997. No ceremony, no ribbon, just a rectangle of polished glass set upright in the earth, rimmed in rust-darkened iron, placed at the edge of what had once been Elmrose Hollow. There were no names engraved, no list of victims, only one question, cut deep into the glass and filled with soot-colored enamel. Do you remember their names? It was all the state would approve, all that could be agreed upon without legal challenge. But it stood nonetheless facing east, catching morning light and the shadows of those who approached. The memorial came after years of pressure. Journalists, amateur archivists, descendants of vanished children, all pushed for recognition. They brought stories, fragments of clothing, faded photographs with too many empty spaces, and finally records, sealed reports leaked and verified. Accounts of what had happened behind the doors of those 14 schools. Not lessons, not classrooms, but structures built for the reshaping of the human will. The outcry was brief but sharp. Hearings were held. A single law passed quietly later that year. All behavioral research involving children in educational settings would require independent third-party oversight, with strict limits on sensory deprivation, isolation, and identity disruption. No institutions were named, no agencies cited, but those who had followed the case knew exactly what the law had been built to prevent. Still, the archives were not fully opened. The Winthrop Foundation's private papers remained sealed under a century clause, hidden in a collection shielded by trustees whose names had long since been replaced by numbers. A handful of documents were digitized. Select ledgers were redacted and made available for academic use. But the deeper records, those that might explain the intent behind the mirror rooms, the tongue removals, the blurred children, the bell that whispered into the skull, remained out of reach. Preserved, but not disclosed. Today, the mirror at Elmrose Hollow stands beside a gravel path. No signs point to it. You have to know it's there. Visitors sometimes leave offerings, scraps of ribbon, single shoes, candles burned down to wax circles. Occasionally, someone leaves a name, etched onto paper and tucked into the grass. The wind takes them all. And inside the Coldwater Historical Museum, in a climate-controlled basement chamber, the bell from school number 9 still sits behind reinforced glass. No one touches it. No one speaks near it. But the staff, those who've stayed long enough, say you can feel something when you're close. A shift in pressure, a faint hum under the bones. A memory that does not belong to you, pressing up from the floor. One curator, working late on an inventory shift, claimed to hear a voice, not in the air, but inside her own ear. It said, "Begin again." She quit the next day. The museum said she was unstable, but she was not the only one who heard it. Because some silences are not empty. Some are designed, shaped, engineered to hold weight. And the kind of silence the Winthrops built, layered in stillness, compliance, obedience, was not meant to teach children. It was meant to erase them, to make them usable, to turn noise into obedience, movement into posture, identity into reflection. That silence lingers, not loudly, not violently, but beneath things, floorboards, bell towers, ledgers. It teaches still. And what we fail to name, we fail to stop. What do you think? Was this calculated madness? Or something more? Could this happen again if we stay silent?